Season 4 of the Missing Witches podcast is lovingly sponsored by our Patreon patrons. Thank you. And Foxglove Farm. Go to foxglovefarm.com and use offer code MissingWitches for 13% off your order.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. 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 You must be a witch.
An archaeologist before there were any. The point of origin for the idea that witches gather in covens. The mother of all subsequent covens, in a way. The first woman to unwrap a mummy, author of the witch cult in Western Europe, criticized for the way she worked, partially because she made flying leaps. She went following something, following her own intuition from what she saw and heard in primary sources, without relying on what experts had already said. Criticized for her cognitive leaps, discredited for the way she pieced through sources, choosing what resonated, and for the way that, over time, the ellipses in some of her quotes go missing. A feminist who marched for the vote and ardently supported women scholars and archaeologists out in the field. A witch who cursed a peer in front of witnesses and became president of the Folklore Society when she was in her 90s. A person of fierce connection to the past who sketched into mainstream modern thought the idea that pre-Christians had a system of worship and practice that was joyful, tied to a goddess, and deeply invested in the earth and animals. This episode is dedicated to that smart as a whip fairy godmother witch, tomb whisperer, and wildly prolific and problematic author, Margaret Alice Murray. Margaret Murray was born on July 13th, 1863 in Calcutta, India. She moved to London in 1894, where she started studies in Egyptology. Murray wasn't just among the first female archaeologists. She was one of the earliest women to make a serious impact upon the world of professional scholarship, at all. She wrote that she wanted to change the means by which the public obtained knowledge about Egypt's history. She wished to throw open the doors to the scientific laboratory and invite the public in. Murray's contributions to archaeology and Egyptology were often overshadowed by that of Flinders Petrie, her mentor, to the extent that she was often thought of primarily as one of Petrie's assistants rather than a scholar in her own right. In 1894, she became one of the first students of the new discipline of Egyptology, picking up on the popular rage for Egyptian history and culture that had followed Napoleon's first short-lived attempt at colonization in Egypt. When the Academy came with their own version of the discovery doctrine in mind, gouging out whole pieces of Egyptian heritage for their museums back home. In this field full of popular frenzy for a new ancient world, Murray worked hard and advanced relatively quickly. She took over the teaching of multiple language classes, created the syllabus and program of study for the field, edited the departmental journal behind the scenes with Petrie as the figurehead for decades. In 1899, Murray was appointed to a junior lectureship at University College London, making her the first female lecturer in archaeology in the UK. According to Rebecca Whitehorse, she undoubtedly deserved to succeed Flinders Petrie to the Edwards Chair of Egyptology when he retired in 1933. But this was a step too far for UCL. The college did not appoint its first female professor until 1949. UCL did, however, award Murray an honorary doctorate in 1931 and make her an honorary fellow the following year, and her students loved her so much they banded together to help her pay for the robes for the ceremony, which she could not afford. This was a single brilliant woman with no financial safety net, writing books that would shift the spin of the spiritual modern world. She started as a copyist and illustrator, helping in the publication of Petrie's book, Coptos. And she started out as Petrie's assistant, and we are sending love to assistants everywhere. You are deep with the magic of the stitching and uplifting. She studied and translated and taught in multiple languages, ancient and modern, and eventually joined excavations in Egypt, Petra, Malta, and many other places. Because her work on the witch trials made such a massive impact on what would become a new modern religion, her archaeological discoveries don't get much airtime. But there are lines that run through all this work. And discoveries she made in Egypt became deeply rooted in her thinking about the religion of witches. On a dig at Abydos in Egypt, Murray discovered the Osirion, the temple of Osiris. The Osirion is still considered a mystery, a strange anomaly in our understanding of how the god of death was loved and worshipped in ancient Egypt. The Osirion is unique in Egypt. It is a series of catacombs dug into the rock. It is a temple underground where they didn't really expect to find one. It's an empty mausoleum to Osiris. Reached by a 420-foot subterranean passage, the center of its 10 massive granite columned burial chamber, which lies at a lower level than Seti's temple, is an empty sarcophagus for the god to rest and return to in his endless cycle of death and rebirth. This chamber is filled with underground water channels which connect to the water table and follow the rise and fall of the Nile, and which create a subterranean island where, deep below ground, surrounded by the sound of water running in the dark, Osiris and the mystery of death and life which he represents would be honored. It has been called one of the holiest places of Egypt. The ritual reenactment of Osiris's funeral rites were held in the last month of the inundation, the annual Nile flood, coinciding with spring, and held at Abydos, where it was said that the body of Osiris drifted ashore after having been drowned in the Nile. Some elements of the ceremony would have been held in the temple, but others involved public participation in a form of theater. The stela of Ikernofret recounts the public elements over the 5 days of the festival. In the first day, a mock battle was enacted during which the enemies of Osiris are defeated. The procession was led by the god Wepwawet, opener of the way. The second day, the great procession, the body of Osiris was taken from his temple to his tomb, and the boat had to be defended against his enemies. And on the third day, Osiris is mourned, and the enemies of the land are destroyed. And on the fourth day, it is a night vigil. Prayers and recitations are made, and funeral rites are performed. The fifth day, Osiris is reborn at dawn and crowned with the crown of Ma'at, and a statue of Osiris is brought to the temple. Osiris is known to us now as a god of death, but he was also a father god. In fact, he was the father in an Egyptian trinity adopted by early Christians. Egyptian philosophy for thousands of years was based on the Holy Trinity, the father god Osiris, the mother goddess Isis, and the son Horus, whom Isis bore without, quote, defiling herself. Early Christians introduced some new details. Temples in Egypt had been dedicated to Isis were transformed into churches. The statues of Isis carrying her child Horus were altered to become the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child. Osiris's annual death and rebirth became the central Christian mystery, and Osiris was left to navigate the Nile below the surface. Around and between the temples of Abydos, where Murray found the Osirion, is a vast complex of cemeteries used in every period of early Egyptian history. Murray was at home among all these bones, looking for humanity's shared spiritual history. Murray was a diffusionist who argued that all of civilization emerged from Egypt, much to the furied chagrin of racist contemporaries who went to great lengths to argue that white people must somehow have come and taught Egyptians their science and governance. Neither stance was totally uncommon in her field at the time, nor was it uncommon for white people studying Egyptian history and culture to conveniently skip over the colonial violence they were implicit in, and to take piecemeal from the graves they dug up to feed their pet theories, or for archeologists to blatantly plunder the digs once they got the rights to study them, if they ever did. Murray and Petrie worked to take a dig away from a notorious Frenchman who was known to cart out pottery and human bones, with zero documentation or academic rigor, let alone respect, and smash them about drunkenly at parties and sell the shards off to the highest bidder. Raised Christian by her mother, Murray had been a Sunday school teacher, but she rejected religion and earned a reputation as a skeptic and a rationalist. She was critical of organized religion, and in her autobiography, she wrote a line that we hold dear to our hearts, a holy scrap from this scrappy and problematic ancestor. She declared that she believed in an unseen overruling power, which science calls nature and religion calls God. She was also a believer and a practitioner of magic, or at least she took delight in playing at it, which, in our view, is the best way to do it. In one case, she cursed a fellow academic, mixing up ingredients in a frying pan in the presence of 2 colleagues. Her goal wasn't to do any harm, but to have him removed from the path of her friend, and within weeks he was promoted out of her way. A perfect spell. Side note, sticking such a person's name into a container of water, say, and putting it in the freezer works well, too. She is also said to have created a wax image of Kaiser Wilhelm II and then melted it during the First World War. If you have been melting images of your own enemies or dictators to give you strength for your ongoing resistance, please know that your work exists in a long and loving lineage.
And now, a word from our sponsor. You all remember Foxglove Farm from our last season. We are so stoked to be working with Sammy again and with Foxglove Farm.
Yeah, this incredible witch in her kitchen makes just such beautiful product and like inspiring things that I actually use all the time that really touch my life. I use the So Moted tea all the time, and I use the calming one too, the anxiety. They're beautiful. They're perfect for my workings at home. And she's just a pleasure and delight. So we really are excited to work with her again and excited for you guys to get an opportunity to discover her witchy boxes.
Right. These subscription boxes, it's like a combination of things you can keep. Like my box had like a little incense plate in it and, artwork, stuff like that. But also things you can consume like soap and tea. Foxglove works with witchy artisans and puts their stuff into the boxes. It's all ethically sourced.
We like it. We love her. We hope you check it out and make use of that sweet, sweet listener offer code, Missing Witches, for 13% off your order. The story of Margaret Murray and her 3 women co-workers and friends dancing among the tombs at Abydos sounds just the perfect amount of witchy to me. Shepard writes that one night there were reports of a disturbance at the site not far from the camp. Wishing to dissuade anyone from vandalizing or stealing objects, Murray, Eckenstein, and Hilda joined hands and danced with a great variety of fancy steps all the way from the camp to the dig. Shepard imagines that the winter at Abydos was probably one of the happiest times of Murray's life. Not only did she get to dig and finally discover Egypt for herself, but like other women who worked in the field, Murray indulged in her other passion, nursing. This useful occupation she had taken up in India was indeed valuable on site. She recalled with fondness that she did all the small doctoring that was required among the workmen, mending cuts, easing indigestion, and relieving eye pain due to blowing sand. In the end, she developed quite a reputation as a healer. Shepard also offers a small aside in a piece of smart biographical guesswork that maybe helps explain why Murray took up a history of witchcraft and how she may have found her way to a theoretical framework for it that had not entered academia before. Murray couldn't work in Egypt after the start of the First World War, and she couldn't teach as most of her students were gone to the war effort. As part of a volunteer group of nurses, she contributed to the effort herself until she burnt out and her health deteriorated, and she was told to get some rest where she didn't know anybody. She went to Glastonbury and found a history of mysteries that would shape the work of the rest of her life. Shepard writes, while Murray was in Glastonbury, she became interested in an ancient pagan religion practiced by worshippers, possibly groups of dwarves or elves, for continued fertility and power. Although she did not mention it in her autobiography, the interest almost certainly came from 2 particular sources. First, being in Glastonbury and focusing on the Abbey and its history, she would have had some interaction with a mystical group called the Avalonians, who created the modern mystical Glastonbury. They would have introduced her to many of the Welsh and English traditions surrounding the story of the Abbey. Second, since they were both archaeologists, she would have had contact with architect and mystic scholar Frederick Bligh Bond, who began excavating at the Abbey in 1908. Both he and the Avalonians would have shared with Murray legends, artifacts, and occult rituals regarding Glastonbury and the power of the Grail. As early as 1899, Bligh Bond had expressed his belief that dimensions of the buildings at Glastonbury Abbey were based on gematria, an ancient mystical alphanumeric code, mostly these days associated with Kabbalah. It seems well established now that Christian architects learned to embed divine numbers in architecture from pagans. The temples of Janus and Cybele were constructed according to the rules of gematria. The temple of Artemis corresponds numerologically to Isis Ais, thou art powerful, O Isis. Gematria encodes a cosmic significance into cathedrals and temples. A Mishnaic textual source, that is the first major written collection of the Jewish oral traditions, first redacted in 3rd century BC, makes this reference to the origins of the idea of spiritual numbers. Rabbi Eleazar Kisma said, the laws of mixed bird offerings and the key to the calculations of menstruation days, these are the body of the halakha, the way. Herbert Danby explains gematria as first astronomy and geometry. Gematria later came to mean the device of finding esoteric meanings in words by means of the numerical values of their constituent letters. But the first holy numbers were tied to menstruating bodies, birds, stars, and the outlines of the shapes of things. Anyway, in 1917, Bleibond published his major work about gematria in the Greek text of the New Testament and in the plans of medieval buildings. In 1908, the Church of England appointed him director of excavations at Glastonbury Abbey. His excavations, right around the time when Murray was in Glastonbury, with its long history of Holy Grail folklore and Western mystery tradition, incredibly rediscovered the nature and dimensions of a number of buildings that had occupied the site. And he found those missing pieces by unconventional means, which ultimately got him fired. Bond's work at Glastonbury Abbey is one of the first documented examples of psychic archaeology. He worked with a retired Navy captain, John Allen Bartlett, who was a medium, and together they claimed to have contacted, through automatic writing, dead monks and the building of the Edgar Chapel at Glastonbury, who advised him where to excavate. In 1919, he published The Gates of Remembrance, which told their story. He was fired in 1921. You have to wonder if you're spending time investigating histories of witchcraft, which I guess you are, eh? Thanks for listening to the Missing Witches podcast. We love you. What if Margaret Murray went looking in the first-hand transcripts and documents of the witch trials to see if there was evidence for a secret she'd already been told by Bly and the Freemasons of Glastonbury, by the people there who kept the story of the Holy Grail, the same people who inspired Dion Fortune, who on her deathbed said, "I am the last of the Avalonians." What if? And what if centuries of lore about magic and the people who could understand what that meant across hundreds of cultures and hundreds of thousands of years has some grounding in the soil? In the millions of years of pre-Christian prehistory, where people fell in love and gave birth and watched the sky, what did a religion and culture that was pre-patriarchy look like? For that matter, while we are imagining magical things, what will a spiritual culture that is post-late-stage capitalism and post-pandemic look like? I don't know. But I wanted to do Margaret Murray this season because I can't help but love her. I get she made mistakes. Mistakes of a kind that keep me up at night, having recently released for final copy edit the manuscript of our first Missing Witches book. I can't help but wonder if there were times when, in evolving these messy podcast scripts into chapters, we missed an ellipses, or asked the wrong questions, or crossed wires in fields we have zero credentials in. Will our future selves look back at us and laugh at our wild guesses gone wildly wrong? We've always said we're just trying to not fuck it up too much as we go about educating ourselves. And my grandmother would famously say, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. So I am wired for sympathy with someone who entered the world of anthropology and Egyptology and archaeology and then British history with little to no background, because she was one of the first women to ever do it and threw herself into the work, into long nights with the symbols carved into the stone, listening and looking at what the remains said, looking for the untold stories. The published critiques of her work from the time sometimes smack of a teeth-clenched bent against women who entered male-dominated spaces, women who were loved and successful and who advanced and from their new vantage point suggested something new. We also know there is a knee-jerk reaction still today in some spaces against anyone who suggests that disobedient women and people of marginalized genders, identities, and cultures, and the earth and even animals might have had access to a sacredness that is outside the purview of a God the Father and the men who choose each other to represent him. Murray may have been wrong about a lot of things. In particular, the idea that the witches' pre-Christian spirituality was a highly organized religion. I doubt being highly organized has ever been a major part of this practice. But we know for sure that another way of having spirituality existed before the centralization and dominance of the church. And we know that people find each other in oppressive times, in small, secret, loosely if at all connected groups, to share ways of giving ourselves a little power. Even feminist historians of science couch their interest in Murray in cautious and apologetic terms. Ruth Whitehorse writes, "An issue that has cast a cloud over Margaret Murray's lasting reputation is the promulgation of her views on witchcraft, though these need to be considered in their historical context. Her basic thesis was that there was a pervasive witch cult in Europe that preserved the essential elements of a pre-Christian religion involving the worship of a horned god, and originally practicing human sacrifice. This theory, propounded in a number of books and a long series of articles, as well as an entry in the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1929, was based on extremely literal interpretations of the witch trials of the early modern period, of folklore, and of some archaeological evidence, Though long discredited in academy, her views were influential at the time, and as late as 1953 she became president of the Folklore Society. Subsequently, her views on witchcraft played a founding role in the formation of the modern Wiccan and neo-pagan movements, which has added to the discomfort of present-day female archaeologists, including myself, who would like to claim her as a worthy female ancestor, but do not wish to be associated with non-mainstream, not to say crackpot, theories of this kind. Many of us experience similar difficulties with the mother goddess theory, equally rejected by mainstream archaeology and also supported by prominent female archaeologists such as Jaquetta Hawkes and Marija Gimbutas. There is, of course, no justification for the abandonment of academic rigor, but it is not too difficult to understand why female archaeologists might prefer historical narratives that attribute power to women, whether as goddesses or witches, over the prevalent male-oriented accounts where women are largely invisible or figure only in domestic roles. Whitehorse does go on to say, a final point one might make is that different but equally unacceptable theories propounded by male archaeologists of the time are given a much more lenient treatment in the literature. Flinders Petrie himself, a supporter of eugenics, believed that Egyptian civilization could not have been the product of African peoples, but was created by a race of intrusive white people, a view that is as clearly discredited as Murray's witch cult, and arguably more damaging, which is rarely considered to tarnish Petrie's reputation. Murray gets dismissed with this snideness that just isn't applied to male authors who dealt with similar theories. Fraser's Golden Bough, Charles Lalanne's Arcadia or the Gospel of the Witches, or Jules Michelet's La Sorcière, for example. But she wrote it all out with dignity. And despite being cancelled in her lifetime and beyond by her peers in the academy, Murray's impact rolls out across the years and into the public mind and imagination like a tremendous wave. Murray was the first person to use the word coven to mean a gathering of witches. She is, in a very real way, the word witch mother of all our covens. Wicca's theological structure, revolving around a horned god and mother goddess, was adopted from Murray's ideas about the ancient witch cult. Wicca's early system of seasonal festivities were based on Murray's sabbats. She described witches using herbs which contained known hallucinogens and ceremonies featuring prolonged ecstatic dancing, techniques which have been studied as employed by shamans of other cultures, resulting in altered mental states, including the sensation of flying. Gerald Gardner, who established the tradition of Gardnerian Wicca and popularized the religion, was a firm believer in her work, and Murray wrote the foreword to Gardner's 1954 book, Witchcraft Today. Doreen Valiente searched for what she believed were other surviving remnants of the Murrayite witch cult around Britain, and remained committed to a belief in Murray's witch cult even after its academic rejection. Murray located the origins of the witch cult in a matriarchal, pre-agricultural civilization. Buried in lengthy quotes from violent witch hunter transcripts, she depicts the witch cult as both a joyous and irrational religion. When Murray took up this work, scholarly writing on witches in Western Europe was essentially non-existent, and in the public mind there were kind of two paths for understanding witches in the history of the burning times. Either witches did exist, and they were evil, anti-Christian, Satan-worshipping, baby-eating, dangerous women. Nasty women. Or the women convicted of witchcraft were all victims of hysteria, who confessed and fabricated under threat of torture. Or, as we now know, during active and malicious and state-orchestrated torture. Murray saw room for a middle ground. She caught glimpses of a real other belief in these transcripts laden with fear and florid with the biases of the torturers. And it is in that fertile in-between, cracked open by her vision, that worlds of thought and spiritual practice have flourished. Margaret Murray published prolifically throughout her life. A total list of over 150 items. Her books included excavation reports, textbooks, general books about ancient Egypt, as well as volumes on divine kingship and the witch cult in Western Europe. She was also an eloquent and activist first-wave feminist. As Whitehorse writes, her feminism extended into her scholarship, which included studies of various aspects of women's lives in ancient Egypt, including social conditions and the roles of women in religion, which were regarded by Petrie and others as too unpleasant for women to study. Archaeologist Ralph Merrifield, who knew Murray through the Folklore Society, described her as a diminutive and kindly scholar who radiated intelligence and strength of character into extreme old age. At meetings, she would sit near the front, a bent and seemingly guileless old lady dozing peacefully, and then in the middle of a discussion would suddenly intervene with a relevant and penetrating comment which showed that she had missed not one word of the argument. At 100 years of age, she published 2 books. One was The Genesis of Religion, in which she argued that humanity's first deities had been goddesses rather than male gods. And the second was her autobiography entitled My First 100 Years. So here's to living a long and full and wise life, investigating exactly whatever interests us. Here's to sharing our own glorious and strange ideas thoughtfully and fearlessly. And here's to uplifting the marginalized voices within the reach of our own strong arms. Let's follow Margaret's lead and throw open the doors, and let each other into our ivory towers, in order to find the knowledge that's missing in the gaps between science and the humanities, religion and natural history, and to build bridges between shattered pieces of knowledge left by destructive ideologies. We need to be willing to leap beyond the status quo. So leap, loves, leap. And while you're at it, cherish and cultivate your covens, whatever that might look like for you. These are our safe and sacred spaces to come home to after long days of leaping. For me, these are what science calls nature and religion calls God. These homes, these circles in the wood, these arms of linking women, these people. And they were spun into the world by this grandmother word witch, Margaret Alice Murray.
You must be a witch.
This episode of the Missing Witches podcast was written and performed by Risa Dickens. Music and editing by Amy Torak. Thanks again to our sponsor, Foxglove Farm. Don't forget to use our listener offer code Missing Witches for 13% off your order. Or make a contribution to their wildlife rescue, Out of the Woods. Find your witchy wellness at Foxglove Farm. That's farm like pharmacy with a ph.com. You can also support Missing Witches on Patreon at patreon.com/missingwitches. And coming soon, Missing Witches t-shirts on TeePublic. And please, we would love it if you would consider pre-ordering our upcoming book, Missing Witches, by Risa Dickens and Amy Torak, published by North Atlantic Books.